My name is Rachel Bennett, 34 years old and one of Portland's top real estate agents. 6 months ago, I had what looked like the perfect life, a successful career, a charming husband named Daniel, and a luxury mountain cabin that was my personal sanctuary. Then I discovered Daniel had secretly sold my beloved retreat for a fraction of its value. I never imagined my world would shatter so completely, or that 48 hours after finding a stranger in my cabin, FBI agents would approach our table during dinner at Portland's most exclusive restaurant. What my husband had been hiding destroyed everything I thought I knew about our marriage. If you've ever trusted someone completely only to have that trust betrayed, stay with me. Before I continue my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button if you've ever felt that gut-wrenching moment when someone you love becomes a stranger. I built my real estate career from nothing. After college, while my friends chased corporate jobs in downtown high-rises, I committed myself to understanding every neighborhood, property value, and market trend in Portland. By 28, I was selling luxury properties to tech executives relocating from California and New York. The commission from my first $1 million sale paid off my student loans. The second bought me a new car. But the third, that one was special. I remember the exact moment I decided to buy the cabin. It was after closing a record-breaking deal on a West Hills estate. My boss handed me a glass of champagne at the celebration and said, "Rachel, you're a natural at this. You've earned something meaningful for yourself." That night, driving home, I took a detour through the winding roads leading to Mount Hood. The forests had always called to me, the scent of pine, the silence broken only by wind through branches. Growing up in an apartment with thin walls and constant noise, I dreamed of a place where silence wasn't something rare and precious but abundant and free. I found the listing the next day, a 2-bedroom cabin on 3 acres, nestled against national forest land, with a wraparound porch and views that made you believe in something greater than yourself. The previous owner was an architect who had modernized the interior while preserving its rustic charm. Vaulted ceilings with exposed beams. A stone fireplace that reached to the roof. Floor-to-ceiling windows that invited nature inside. The asking price was $250,000, every penny I had saved plus a stretch. But standing on that porch during the viewing, watching eagles soar over distant peaks, I knew some investments aren't measured in dollars but in breaths taken away. I made an offer that afternoon. When I first brought Daniel to see it after we started dating, he seemed to appreciate what it meant to me. He was still building his financial advisory business then, working long hours and trying to establish a reputation. The cabin became our weekend retreat, a place where cell reception was spotty enough to justify disconnecting. "This is incredible," he'd said that first visit, watching the sunset paint the mountains in watercolor shades of orange and pink. "You made a smart investment." But over time, his enthusiasm waned. The 2-hour drive became too long for his weekend schedule. The isolation that restored my soul made him antsy. The spotty internet that I considered a feature became his frustration. "I don't understand why you need to go up there every month," he'd complained last winter. "It's just sitting empty most of the time." "It's not about using it every day," I'd tried explaining. "It's about having a place that's completely mine, that exists outside of work and city life." He never really understood that the cabin's value wasn't in its market price but in what it represented, my independence, my success, my refuge. I'd bought it with my money, maintained it with my time, and loved it with a dedication that surprised even me. As our marriage progressed and our careers demanded more time, the cabin became primarily my retreat. Daniel stopped joining me on my monthly maintenance trips. I'd spend weekends raking leaves in autumn, checking pipes in winter, planting wildflowers in spring. The neighbors, a retired couple a quarter-mile down the road, would wave when they saw my car and occasionally bring over homemade jam or fresh eggs. The property had only appreciated since my purchase. Similar cabins in the area were now selling for over $300,000, sometimes more if they had comparable views and privacy. Several developers had left notes on the door, offering to buy if I ever considered selling. I kept those notes in a file but never seriously considered their offers. How do you put a price on sanctuary? My last happy weekend at the cabin had been just a month before everything fell apart. I'd spent a peaceful Saturday hiking nearby trails, then built a fire and read until midnight, wrapped in a quilt my grandmother had made. Sunday morning, I'd sat on the porch drinking coffee, watching mist rise from the valley below as the sun cleared the mountains. In that moment, I felt a contentment so complete that it almost frightened me, as though by acknowledging such perfect happiness, I might somehow invite its opposite. If only I'd known how prophetic that feeling would prove to be. April had been brutal at work. I'd lost a major listing to a competitor, then had 2 sales fall through due to financing issues. By the first Friday in May, I needed the cabin more than ever. I'd already packed my overnight bag and grocery shopped for the weekend when I noticed the key was missing from my key ring. The cabin key had its special place. A small silver mountain charm attached to differentiate it from my work and home keys. Now, the ring had a conspicuous gap where the charm should have been. Daniel was in the kitchen making coffee when I asked, "Have you seen my cabin key?" "It's not on my ring." He didn't turn around immediately, which struck me as odd. When he did face me, his expression was casual, but something in his eyes seemed off. I might have borrowed it last week to get something. Probably left it in my desk drawer. I frowned. "What would you need from the cabin? You haven't been there in months." "Just some documents I stored in the safe." He sipped his coffee. "Actually, this might not be the best weekend to go up there. We've been invited to the Miller's dinner party tomorrow night, remember?" I didn't remember any such invitation, and Daniel knew how sacred my first weekend of the month cabin trips were. I never scheduled over them. "That doesn't sound right," I said slowly. "And I really need this break, Daniel. It's been a rough month." He shrugged, suddenly busy with his phone. "Your call. But I can't find the key right now. Maybe postpone until next weekend? I'll help you look for it later." Something about his demeanor raised the fine hairs on my neck. Daniel wasn't usually evasive. As a financial advisor, directness was his professional trademark. "No problem," I said, keeping my voice light. "I've got the spare at the office. I'll swing by and grab it." I caught a flicker of something, alarm, cross his face before he smoothed it away with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sure, whatever works. Text me when you get there safely." The drive to the cabin usually cleared my mind. The gradual transition from city to suburbs to rural countryside to wilderness marked the shift from Rachel the realtor to just Rachel. But that day, uneasiness rode with me like an unwelcome passenger. Daniel's behavior kept replaying in my mind, each mental rewatch revealing new suspicious details: the way he'd avoided eye contact, his sudden mention of a non-existent dinner party, the slight tremor in his hand as he'd held his coffee mug. When I turned onto the private road leading to the cabin, the first wrongness jumped out immediately. The security gate I'd installed last year stood open when it should have been locked. I slowed the car, stomach tightening. Perhaps a maintenance worker I'd scheduled? But I hadn't arranged any work for this weekend. As I rounded the final bend, the second wrongness appeared, an unfamiliar black Mercedes parked in my spot. My heart began pounding against my ribs as I pulled up behind it. The cabin looked the same, the weathered cedar siding, green metal roof, the porch with my 2 Adirondack chairs positioned for the best mountain view. But the curtains in the front window had been changed. Mine were forest green, these were cream-colored. I approached my own front door like an intruder, the spare key clutched in my suddenly sweaty palm. It didn't fit in the lock. I tried again, wiggling it, then examining the door more carefully. The hardware was different, newer, with a different finish than the antique brass I'd chosen. My hand was shaking as I knocked. Seconds stretched like hours before the door swung open to reveal a tall, silver-haired man in his 50s, wearing an expression of polite curiosity. "Can I help you?" His voice had the crisp consonants of the East Coast. This is my cabin," I managed to say, my voice sounding distant in my own ears. His eyebrows rose, then furrowed in concern. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. I purchased this property 3 weeks ago." The world tilted slightly. That's impossible. I didn't sell it. The man, who later introduced himself as Alexander Weber, regarded me with a mixture of confusion and growing sympathy. Perhaps you should come inside. I have the paperwork. The interior felt like walking into an alternate reality, simultaneously familiar and wrong. The bones were the same, the vaulted ceiling, stone fireplace, the layout of the rooms. But the furnishings were different. My comfortable sectional had been replaced with a leather sofa. New artwork hung where my family photos had been. The dining table where I'd spent countless mornings gazing at the mountains while nursing coffee was gone, replaced by something larger and more ornate. Weber returned from another room with a folder, which he opened on the kitchen counter. Here's the deed and sale documentation. I purchased it from Daniel Bennett. Are you related to him? The room seemed to contract around me as I stared at the papers. There was the deed, with Daniel's signature where mine should have been. The sale price made my knees buckle, $60,000. 1/5 of its market value. I'm Rachel Bennett, I whispered. Daniel is my husband. Weber's expression shifted to one of genuine concern. Mrs. Bennett, I'm so sorry. I had no idea there was any issue with the sale. Your husband assured me you were both downsizing properties and needed a quick, private transaction. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy as I pulled up photos of myself in the cabin, proof of my ownership. Weber examined them, his face growing increasingly troubled. This is very concerning, he said finally. I conducted this transaction in good faith. All the paperwork appeared to be in order. What he didn't say, but what hung in the air between us, was the obvious: my husband had forged my signature and sold my property without my knowledge or consent. I tried calling Daniel but got his voicemail. My text, "What have you done?" went unanswered, the message marked as read but ignored. Weber offered me a glass of water and a chair. Take whatever time you need. This is obviously a shock. I sat in what used to be my kitchen, now populated with someone else's appliances and dishware, and tried to process the impossible. Daniel and I had our issues like any couple, but this crossed into criminal territory. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that my brain struggled to accept it as reality. After collecting myself enough to drive, I thanked Weber for his understanding and left him my contact information. This isn't over, I told him. I never signed those papers. The drive back to Portland was a blur of tears and unanswered phone calls. My husband had stolen and sold my sanctuary, forged my name, and pocketed the money. And for what? $60,000 was a significant sum, but nothing that would change our financial situation dramatically. What could have driven him to this extreme betrayal? By the time I pulled into our driveway, grief had hardened into something sharper. I needed answers, and I wouldn't leave without them. Daniel's car was in the driveway when I arrived home, which surprised me. Part of me had expected him to run once his deception was discovered. I found him in our home office, surrounded by papers, his laptop open before him. He looked up when I entered, and I saw the moment of calculation in his eyes, weighing whether he could still talk his way out of this. You sold my cabin. My voice came out steadier than I felt. You forged my signature and sold my property without my knowledge or permission. He closed the laptop slowly. Rachel, I can explain. Please do. I remained standing in the doorway, arms crossed. Explain why you committed fraud. Explain why you sold a $300,000 property for $60,000. Explain why you betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I'd once found endearing. Now it just seemed like the tell of a man buying time to construct his next lie. The business is in trouble, he finally said. Has been for months. I didn't want to worry you. So instead you stole from me? I didn't steal. He stood up, indignant. I was going to replace the money. Make it right. With what? If your business is failing, where would you get $300,000? His eyes slid away from mine. It's more complicated than that. We were overextended. There were investment opportunities that didn't pan out. Greg and I took some risks that. Greg? I interrupted. Your business partner is involved in this too? Not in the sale directly, but. Daniel sank back into his chair. We've been trying to turn things around. There were some clients who pulled their investments. Threats of lawsuits. We needed liquid capital fast to settle some issues quietly. The pieces were beginning to align, each one making the picture worse. So you sold my cabin. For a fraction of its worth. To a stranger. Weber wasn't a random buyer. He's a client of Greg's, someone who could complete the purchase quickly and discreetly, without the usual processes that might have raised questions. Questions like why the actual owner wasn't involved in the sale of her own property? My voice rose despite my efforts to remain calm. Daniel winced. I know how it sounds. It sounds like fraud, Daniel. It sounds like criminal activity. I was shouting now, months of accumulated stress combining with the fresh betrayal. Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I just wouldn't notice someone else living in my cabin? I was going to tell you, he insisted. After things stabilized. The $60,000 kept us afloat, paid off the most pressing debts. I was going to find a way to buy you an even better property once we recovered. The delusion in his statement would have been laughable if it wasn't so infuriating. You sold a property you didn't own, at a fifth of its value, without permission, and you think you can just replace it like a broken appliance? He stood again, moving toward me with hands outstretched. Rachel, please. I know I violated your trust. But everything I did was to protect us, our lifestyle, our future. I stepped back, avoiding his touch. Don't. Just don't. The man before me suddenly seemed like a stranger wearing my husband's face. What else haven't you told me? What other secrets are you keeping? His hesitation told me everything. There was more, perhaps much more. The business issues are complicated, he said carefully. Some of our investment strategies were aggressive. Greg has connections that allowed us to pursue opportunities that aren't available to everyone. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning we took some shortcuts. Regulatory gray areas. But we're fixing it. I felt physically ill. The Daniel I thought I'd married was ethical to a fault, building his business on transparency and trust. Now he stood before me casually admitting to financial improprieties as though describing a minor traffic violation. I need to get out of here, I said, turning toward the door. I can't even look at you right now. Where are you going? Panic edged into his voice. To Natalie's. My best friend since college would take me in, no questions asked. I need space to think. Rachel, please. His voice cracked. We can work through this. I'll make it right. I paused in the doorway, not trusting myself to look back at him. You forged my signature. You stole my property. You lied to my face when I asked about the key. There's no making right something like this, Daniel. This isn't a mistake. It's a crime. I packed a bag while he hovered anxiously in the bedroom doorway, still trying to explain, to justify, to minimize. I moved around him as though he were furniture, focusing on the mechanical task of gathering enough clothes and essentials for a few days. When I reached the front door, he made one last plea, at least let me explain everything. Dinner tomorrow night? Somewhere public if that makes you more comfortable. Part of me wanted to refuse, to cut all contact until I could process this betrayal. But another part needed answers, needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. Fine. Text me the details. And then I was gone, my world in fragments around me. Natalie's reaction when I told her everything confirmed I wasn't overreacting. As both my friend and an attorney, her perspective carried weight. He committed multiple felonies, she said, pouring me a generous glass of wine in her apartment that evening. Forgery, fraud, this isn't a gray area, Rachel. I know. I stared into the burgundy liquid, seeing my distorted reflection. I just can't understand why. 60,000 isn't life-changing money for us. It might be if they're facing legal threats. Natalie sat beside me on the sofa. If their business practices are as questionable as it sounds, they might be trying to settle complaints quietly before they escalate to formal investigations. The possibility that Daniel's entire business might be built on fraudulent practices was too overwhelming to contemplate. I'd been married to him for 5 years, and in all that time I'd never suspected anything like this. What did that say about my judgment? About my knowledge of the man I shared my life with? What should I do? I asked finally. Natalie considered this, lawyer mode engaged. Document everything. Get copies of your original cabin purchase, your signature on file at various institutions. We need to establish the forgery concretely. She squeezed my hand. And Rachel? Protect yourself first. Whatever's happening with Daniel's business could have serious repercussions. I nodded, exhaustion settling into my bones. The confrontation had drained me completely, leaving behind an empty numbness where my anger had been. He wants to meet for dinner tomorrow to explain everything. Public place? When I nodded, she continued, good. Go, listen, gather information. But don't agree to anything, don't sign anything, and for God's sake, don't believe everything he tells you. That night, lying in Natalie's guest bedroom, I replayed years of memories, searching for signs I might have missed. Had there been hints of this capacity for betrayal all along? Or had my husband transformed into someone unrecognizable without my noticing? Either possibility was terrifying in its implications. Sleep came eventually, but brought no rest, only dreams of cabins with locks I couldn't open and husbands with faces that kept changing. The next morning, Natalie and I sat at her kitchen table with legal pads, coffee, and her laptop. The friend who had comforted me the night before was now replaced by Natalie Williams, attorney at law, her expression focused and professional. Let's talk options, she said, creating a new document. Legally, we're looking at several issues. First, the fraudulent sale itself. Second, potential business fraud if Daniel's company is engaged in illegal activities. Can we just get the cabin back? That was my primary concern, reclaiming my sanctuary. Natalie frowned. It's complicated. Weber purchased in good faith, with what appeared to be legitimate documentation. Unwinding the sale would involve proving the forgery, criminal charges against Daniel, and potentially a civil suit against Weber if he refuses to cooperate. My stomach dropped. I don't want to send Daniel to jail. Despite everything, the thought of my husband in prison made me physically ill. That might not be in your control, Natalie said gently. Forgery is a criminal offense. If you pursue recovering the cabin, the criminal aspects will almost certainly come to light. I stared into my coffee, watching cream create cloudy spirals. What about Weber? Should I talk to him again? Not yet. First, let's gather more information about him. Something feels off about this whole transaction. We spent the next hour researching Alexander Weber online. His digital footprint was substantial but carefully curated, the profile of a successful businessman with investments across various industries. But digging deeper revealed concerning patterns. Several businesses connected to him had faced regulatory scrutiny. 2 had been investigated for potential money laundering, though charges were never filed. His name appeared in Panama Papers leaks, connected to offshore accounts. This doesn't look good, Natalie murmured, scrolling through news archives. Weber has questionable financial connections. The fact that he paid cash for your cabin at well below market value raises red flags about potential money laundering. You think my cabin was purchased with dirty money? It's a classic pattern. Use illegitimate funds to purchase assets, especially undervalued ones, then sell them later at market price. The resulting money appears to come from legitimate real estate profit. The implications were staggering. Not only had Daniel stolen my property, but he might have involved me in criminal financial schemes. What about this Greg person? Natalie asked. Daniel's business partner? Greg Thompson. I've met him at company events, but don't know much about him personally. He always seemed slick. Very charismatic, but something about him made me uneasy. We should look into him too. Greg's online presence was more limited than Weber's, but what we found was concerning. He'd been named in a securities fraud investigation 5 years earlier, though he wasn't ultimately charged. His previous financial firm had dissolved under murky circumstances. Most worryingly, we found a tenuous connection between Greg and Weber predating Daniel's involvement. They'd both served on the advisory board of a charity that disbanded after financial irregularities were discovered. They knew each other, I whispered. This wasn't some random client connection. Rachel, Natalie said carefully, I think we need to consider that Daniel might be involved in something much bigger than just selling your cabin. This has the hallmarks of organized financial fraud. The thought was so overwhelming that I had to put my head in my hands. How had my life come to this? From successful real estate agent with a perfect marriage to potential victim and unwitting accessory to financial crimes, all in the span of 24 hours. I need to see what else Daniel's been hiding, I said finally. He'll be at his office all day. I'm going home to search his papers. Natalie looked concerned. Are you sure that's safe? What if he comes back? He won't. Friday afternoons are always booked solid with client meetings. I stood, suddenly energized by purpose. Besides, I still live there. I have every right to be in my own house. The house felt different when I returned, familiar but tainted. I went directly to Daniel's home office and began methodically searching through his files. Most contained the ordinary documentation of life, tax returns, insurance policies, warranties for appliances. But in the back of his filing cabinet, I found a locked metal box I'd never seen before. The key wasn't immediately visible, but I knew Daniel's habits. He hid important keys in books, specifically, hollowed-out business books on his shelf. I found it in The Intelligent Investor, exactly where I suspected it would be. Inside the box lay the evidence of my husband's double life, financial statements showing massive personal debt I'd known nothing about, correspondence between Daniel and Greg discussing alternative revenue streams and off-book transactions, and most damning of all, emails about the cabin sale. Weber needs to move the funds quickly, one email from Greg read. He's willing to pay cash, but the price needs to stay low to avoid scrutiny. Can you handle the documentation issue with R? Daniel's reply chilled me. She rarely checks the property records. By the time she notices anything, we'll have leveraged the capital into enough return to replace it. Just keep this transaction off the radar. They had discussed me as though I were an obstacle to be managed, not a person whose trust was being violated. And the casual reference to documentation issues made it clear they both knew they were committing fraud. As I continued searching, I found more evidence of their entanglement with Weber and other questionable clients. References to shell companies. Discussions of cleaning certain investments. Warnings about potential regulatory investigation. The most recent email exchange, dated just 3 days earlier, showed their mounting panic. Greg. Wallace is threatening to go to the SEC if we don't return his full investment by end of month. We need another $120K. Daniel, working on liquidating additional assets. The cabin sale bought us some time but not enough. Weber says he might have another opportunity but wants assurances about discretion. Greg, make it happen. Too much at stake to get squeamish now. I photographed everything with my phone, my hands shaking with anger and fear. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. Daniel and Greg were clearly involved in serious financial misconduct, possibly money laundering, and using my property to facilitate it. When my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel confirming dinner reservations at Castagna, one of Portland's most exclusive restaurants, I felt a surge of determination. I would meet him, confront him with what I'd found, and demand the complete truth. As I was leaving, a final discovery stopped me cold. In Daniel's desk drawer, underneath some random papers, lay a brochure for international banking in the Cayman Islands, along with notes about residency requirements. Was he planning to flee the country if things fell apart? I photographed these too, then carefully returned everything to its original position. Whatever Daniel had become, whatever he was involved in, I needed to protect myself. And that meant gathering as much evidence as possible before confronting him with what I knew. Castagna's elegant interior normally brought me comfort, the soft lighting, muted conversations, the understated luxury that made it Portland's premier fine dining destination. But that evening, sitting across from Daniel at a corner table, the restaurant felt like a stage set for an unfolding drama. Daniel had arrived before me, already nursing a scotch when I slid into my seat. He looked haggard, with shadows under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights, but he'd made an effort, wearing the charcoal suit I'd always liked, his wedding ring prominently displayed on his left hand. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that once would have melted my defenses. "I ordered the Willamette Valley Pinot you like." The sommelier appeared on cue, presenting a bottle for approval. I nodded automatically, going through the motions of normalcy while feeling anything but normal. Once our wine was poured and initial dinner orders placed, Daniel leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Rachel, I know I've broken your trust in the worst possible way. But I need you to understand that everything I did was because our financial situation had become desperate." "So desperate that fraud seemed like the only option?" I kept my voice low, conscious of nearby diners. He winced. "It's not that simple." "Actually, it is. You stole my property. You forged my signature. You conspired with Greg and this Weber character to conduct a transaction that appears designed for money laundering." I took a sip of wine, watching his face pale. "Did I miss anything?" Daniel glanced around nervously. "Keep your voice down, please." "Why? Afraid someone might hear about your crimes?" "Rachel, you don't understand the pressure we've been under. The business started struggling last year when the market turned. Some investments went bad. Clients started demanding their money back all at once. So you started robbing Peter to pay Paul?" His silence was confirmation enough. "Tell me about Greg and Alexander Weber," I said, placing my phone on the table between us. "I found your emails, Daniel. I know Weber isn't just some random buyer." Daniel's knuckles whitened around his glass. "Greg knows people. When things got bad, he suggested some alternative financing sources." "You mean criminals?" "Businessmen who operate outside conventional channels," he corrected, as though the euphemism somehow lessened the reality. "Weber needed to place some capital. We needed liquidity. It was mutually beneficial. Except for me, who lost her property in the process." I leaned forward. "Do you even hear yourself? You sound like someone I don't know." Our appetizers arrived, a choreographed intrusion that forced a momentary pause in our confrontation. The server described each element of the dishes with practiced enthusiasm, oblivious to the tension crackling between us. When we were alone again, Daniel seemed to shift strategies. "I know I've hurt you unforgivably. But you need to understand that if this becomes public, if you pursue legal action about the cabin, it won't just ruin me. The fallout will touch you too." "Are you threatening me now?" "I'm being realistic." His eyes met mine, pleading. "We can still contain this. Weber is willing to transfer the cabin back to you once certain transactions clear. Greg has a plan to make everyone whole." "More fraud to cover the existing fraud?" I shook my head in disbelief. "When does it end, Daniel? And how deep are you actually in?" He looked down at his untouched food. "There have been some financial irregularities at the firm for a while now. Greg initiated most of it before I became partner, but I looked the other way. Then participated. It started small, fudging some returns, moving money between accounts temporarily. And escalated to selling property you didn't own. The cabin was a last resort," he insisted. "We needed to settle with a particular client immediately. Someone who could make serious trouble for us." I was about to press for more details when something in Daniel's expression changed, his eyes focusing on something behind me, his face draining of color. Daniel Bennett, a woman's voice spoke from just over my shoulder. I turned to see a woman and man standing beside our table, both in conservative business attire, both with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. Yes? Daniel's voice had gone hoarse. The woman displayed a badge. Agent Monica Carter, FBI. This is Agent James Reynolds. We'd like to speak with you and Mrs. Bennett about some financial matters. The restaurant seemed to go silent around us, though objectively I knew conversations continued. Several nearby diners were now watching with undisguised interest. Is this really necessary right now? Daniel asked, his attempt at composure betrayed by the tremor in his voice. I'm afraid it is, Agent Reynolds replied. We've been investigating Gregory Thompson for securities fraud and money laundering. Your name has come up repeatedly in our investigation. I felt suspended in a moment of surreal clarity, watching my husband's professional facade crumble, seeing the glances from other diners, hearing the soft music that continued to play incongruously in the background. And the cabin sale? I found myself asking. Alexander Weber? Agent Carter's gaze shifted to me, her expression revealing nothing. Mr. Weber is a person of interest in several ongoing investigations. The purchase of your property flagged in our systems due to the significant undervaluation and cash transaction. Daniel looked physically ill. We should continue this conversation elsewhere. That would be best, Agent Reynolds agreed. We have a field office downtown. Would you be willing to accompany us there to answer some questions? Not an arrest, not yet, but clearly not optional either. Daniel looked at me, naked panic in his eyes, silently pleading for, what? Support? Complicity? Understanding? I met his gaze steadily. I'll follow in my car. The walk through the restaurant felt interminable. Every eye seemed to track our progress, the failed financial advisor and his real estate agent wife, escorted out by federal agents. Our untouched dinner remained on the table, an abandoned set piece in what had become a public humiliation. Outside, as the agents spoke quietly to Daniel near their vehicle, I stood apart, the May evening suddenly chilly despite the mild temperature. My marriage, I realized with crystalline clarity, was over. Whatever happened next, whatever explanations or justifications Daniel might offer, there was no coming back from this breach of trust. As I watched him nod at something Agent Carter said, his shoulders slumped in defeat, I felt an unexpected emotion cut through my anger and shock, pity. Somewhere along the way, the man I'd married had lost himself, had compromised his integrity one small decision at a time until he became someone capable of betraying the person he'd promised to cherish. I followed the federal agent's car downtown, wondering how many other wives had made this same drive, trailing behind husbands whose secret lives had finally caught up with them. The FBI field office occupied several floors of a nondescript government building in downtown Portland. Inside, the fluorescent lighting and institutional furniture created an environment designed for functionality rather than comfort, a stark contrast to the restaurant we'd just left. Agent Carter led me to an interview room while Agent Reynolds took Daniel elsewhere. The separation was expected but still jarring, the physical manifestation of the division that had already occurred in our marriage. Would you like some water, Mrs. Bennett? Agent Carter asked, her tone professional but not unkind. I nodded, suddenly aware of how dry my mouth had become. The reality of being in an FBI interview room was beginning to penetrate the shock that had carried me through the restaurant scene. Agent Carter returned with a paper cup of water and sat across from me at the small table. I understand this must be extremely disorienting for you. Let me clarify a few things. You are not currently a suspect in our investigation. We're interested in your husband's business activities with Gregory Thompson and certain clients, including Alexander Weber. I knew nothing about any of it until yesterday, I said, hearing the defensive note in my voice. I discovered my cabin had been sold without my knowledge when I went there and found Mr. Weber living in it. So the signature on the deed transfer wasn't yours? Absolutely not. Daniel forged it. I have samples of my actual signature for comparison. I pulled out my phone, showing her the documentation I'd photographed earlier. I also found emails between Daniel and Greg discussing the sale and explicitly mentioning documentation issues regarding me. Agent Carter's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in her professional demeanor. "You've been busy. We'd like to see those emails." For the next hour, I shared everything I'd discovered, from the initial missing key to the Cayman Islands brochures. Agent Carter took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly letting me talk. When I finished, she sat back in her chair. "Mrs. Bennett, we've been investigating Thompson Financial Advisors for nearly 8 months. They first came onto our radar through suspicious transaction patterns that suggested potential money laundering. As we dug deeper, we found evidence of securities fraud, wire fraud, and potentially other financial crimes." "And Daniel? How involved is he?" She chose her words carefully. "Your husband became partner in the firm approximately 2 years ago. The questionable activities predate his partnership, but they accelerated significantly after his involvement." My heart sank. Not just a reluctant participant, then, but an active one. "Alexander Weber is of particular interest to us," Agent Carter continued. "He's associated with an organization that specializes in cleaning illegitimate funds through real estate transactions. The cabin purchase fits their typical pattern, buying significantly undervalued properties with cash, then either holding them as assets or reselling at market value to create the appearance of legitimate profit." "So my cabin was purchased with dirty money?" "We believe so, yes. The knowledge that my sanctuary, my personal refuge, had been used in a money laundering scheme made me physically nauseous. Everything it had represented to me felt tainted now." "What happens next?" I asked. "We're interviewing your husband now. Based on what we learn, there may be arrests tonight. Gregory Thompson is already in custody." The matter-of-fact statement stunned me. "Greg's been arrested? When?" "Approximately 2 hours ago. We've been building this case methodically for months. Your husband's involvement with the cabin sale actually accelerated our timeline when it connected to Weber. 2 hours ago. While I was getting ready for dinner, putting on makeup and choosing earrings, the FBI had been arresting my husband's business partner. While I'd been planning my confrontation, federal agents had been planning theirs. Will Daniel go to jail?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. Agent Carter's expression softened slightly. "That depends on many factors, including his level of cooperation and the full extent of his involvement. But yes, Mrs. Bennett, the crimes we're investigating carry potential prison sentences." The interview continued for another hour as we went through my statements more formally. I signed documents, provided contact information, agreed to make myself available for further questioning. The procedural aspects gave me something concrete to focus on, a brief respite from the emotional tornado. Eventually, there was a knock on the door. Agent Reynolds entered, his expression revealing nothing about how Daniel's interview had gone. "Mrs. Bennett, we've arranged for you to speak briefly with your husband if you wish. Just to be clear, this conversation will not be private, we'll be present throughout." I hesitated, uncertain whether I wanted to face Daniel again so soon. But something compelled me forward, perhaps the need for closure, or simply morbid curiosity about what he might say when backed into this particular corner. They led me to another room where Daniel sat at a table, looking utterly defeated. When he saw me, a complex mix of emotions crossed his face: shame, relief, desperation. "Rachel." My name came out ragged. "I'm so sorry." The agents remained by the door, giving us the illusion of privacy while maintaining clear supervision. "Did you know they were investigating you?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not specifically. We knew there were problems. Greg was getting paranoid, saying we needed to clean up certain files, move some assets offshore. I didn't realize how bad it was until recently." "The cabin sale was part of this cleanup?" Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Weber offered immediate cash, no questions asked. Greg said it was the perfect solution, it would give us operating capital to settle with the most dangerous clients while keeping the transaction relatively small and under the radar." And you just decided my property was expendable? Without even talking to me? I convinced myself it was temporary, he said, his voice hollow. That I'd find a way to buy it back for you once things stabilized. I told myself I was protecting you by keeping you out of it. The self-delusion was almost impressive in its completeness. You weren't protecting me, Daniel. You were protecting yourself from having to admit what you'd become. He flinched as though I'd slapped him. They're offering me a deal. Reduced charges if I cooperate fully against Greg and Weber's organization. Are you going to take it? Yes. For the first time, he met my eyes directly. It's still prison time, Rachel. And I'll lose my license, my career. Everything we built. You lost me the moment you forged my signature, I said, the words emerging with quiet finality. Whatever happens next, you need to understand that our marriage is over. Daniel seemed to collapse further into himself, nodding slightly as though he'd expected nothing less. As I stood to leave, he spoke again, his voice barely audible. What will you do now? I considered the question. First, I'm going to fight to get my cabin back. Then I'll rebuild my life, without you in it. Agent Carter escorted me out of the building after explaining that they might need me to testify if cases proceeded to trial. The night air felt cleansing as I emerged onto the street, as though I'd been holding my breath inside that building, inside my marriage, for longer than I'd realized. I called my sister Lauren in Boston, something I'd been putting off since the discovery. Hearing her voice unleashed the tears I'd been suppressing throughout the interviews. I'm booking a flight right now, she said after I explained the situation. You shouldn't be alone through this. That night, in Natalie's guest room again, I stared at the ceiling, processing the surreal sequence of events that had upended my life in just 48 hours. My husband was likely heading to prison. My cabin was purchased with dirty money and might be tied up in legal proceedings for months or years. My name would be associated with a financial fraud scandal that would undoubtedly make local news. Yet beneath the chaos and pain, I felt the first tentative stirrings of something unexpected, relief. The truth, however devastating, had an intrinsic value. I was no longer living inside a lie, no longer married to someone wearing a mask of integrity. The path forward would be difficult, but at least it would be authentic. I texted my parents in Florida, asking if we could talk tomorrow. I wasn't ready to explain everything tonight, but I needed their support in the days ahead. Then I turned off my phone, took the sleeping pill Natalie had offered, and surrendered to exhaustion. The next morning, headlines in the Oregonian confirmed my worst fears about public exposure. Local financial firm raided by FBI, Thompson and Bennett accused of fraud. A smaller related article mentioned the cabin specifically, luxury cabin central to money laundering investigation. My name appeared in both pieces, identified as Daniel's wife and the rightful owner of the fraudulently sold property. My phone began ringing almost immediately, colleagues, clients, acquaintances all curious about the scandal touching their periphery. I silenced it after the third call. This will blow over, Natalie assured me over coffee, though her expression suggested otherwise. But you might want to stay here a few more days. There might be reporters watching your house. The thought of camera crews and microphones felt unbearable. My entire career was built on reputation and relationships. How many clients would want a real estate agent connected to financial fraud handling their million-dollar transactions? My broker called later that morning, her tone carefully neutral. Rachel, we need to talk about how to handle this situation. The firm is receiving inquiries. I've done nothing wrong, I said immediately. I know that, she replied, though something in her voice suggested innocent and untainted were different categories in her mind. But perception matters in our business. We're thinking a temporary leave might be best for everyone while this plays out. A temporary leave that would cost me active listings and future clients. The professional consequences were beginning to crystallize, collateral damage from Daniel's crimes. The legal machinery moved with surprising speed. Daniel was released on bail but with travel restrictions and an ankle monitor. Greg remained in custody, deemed a flight risk due to recently purchased plane tickets to a non-extradition country. The FBI had seized computers, files, and assets from Thompson Financial Advisors, effectively shutting down the business. Weber, however, had disappeared, likely tipped off by associates before the FBI could apprehend him. The cabin remained in legal limbo, formally seized by the government as potential evidence and proceeds of criminal activity. Through Natalie's legal connections, I secured a meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office handling the case. A serious young prosecutor named Eric Donovan explained my options. The good news, Mrs. Bennett, is that we believe you were completely uninvolved and unaware of the fraud. The bad news is that recovering your property quickly will be complicated by its connection to Weber and the money laundering investigation. How complicated? I asked. We're talking months at minimum, possibly years if the case goes to trial. Years without my sanctuary. Years with my property tied up in legal proceedings. The thought was devastating. Is there any way to expedite the process? Donovan hesitated. Your husband has already offered cooperation against both Thompson and Weber's organization. If you were willing to testify about the forgery and fraudulent sale, it would strengthen our case significantly. You want me to testify against Daniel? The request, though logical, felt like another betrayal, this time one I would be committing. Your testimony would primarily establish the fraudulent nature of the cabin sale, which is a key link between Thompson Financial and Weber's money laundering operation. I understood the subtext. If I wanted my cabin back sooner rather than later, I needed to actively participate in building the case against my own husband. I need time to think about it, I said finally. Outside the federal building, I found two reporters waiting, somehow having learned about my meeting. They shouted questions about Daniel, about the cabin, about whether I'd known about the fraud all along. I pushed past them without comment, heart racing, and ducked into a coffee shop to escape. While hiding in the back corner, I received a text from Daniel's mother. How could you abandon him when he needs you most? Family stands together in crisis. The message sent a surge of anger through me. I'd been victimized by Daniel's crimes, yet his family expected loyalty to the man who had betrayed me so completely? I left the message unanswered. My own parents arrived that afternoon, having flown in from Florida as soon as they heard. Their unconditional support was both comforting and overwhelming, my father's quiet fury at Daniel, my mother's tearful embrace as she whispered, "We're here now. You don't have to handle this alone." The practical considerations of separation began to accumulate. I needed to move my belongings out of our house, now just Daniel's house in my mind. I needed a more permanent living arrangement than Natalie's guest room. I needed to establish separate finances, though thankfully we'd maintained individual accounts alongside our joint ones. When I finally gathered the courage to visit the house for essential items, Daniel was absent, meeting with his defense attorney, according to the note he'd left. The absence was a relief. I couldn't imagine facing him in what had once been our shared space. Moving methodically from room to room, I collected clothes, important documents, irreplaceable photos, and personal mementos. The task felt both pragmatic and deeply symbolic, physically sorting through the elements of my life worth preserving from those I needed to leave behind. In the bedroom closet, I found the anniversary gift I'd purchased weeks earlier for our upcoming 6th anniversary, a vintage watch I'd tracked down because it matched one his grandfather had owned. The sight of it, still wrapped in silver paper with a card attached, broke something inside me. I sat on the closet floor and wept. Not for the marriage I was losing, but for the marriage I'd thought I had. A week after the FBI intervention at the restaurant, I met with a divorce attorney. The meeting was surreal, discussing division of assets while Daniel's assets were potentially subject to criminal forfeiture, talking about grounds for divorce when felony fraud involving my property wasn't a standard checkbox on the forms. This is an unusual situation, the attorney acknowledged. But the criminal case actually simplifies some aspects of the divorce. No judge will contest your grounds, and the financial deception creates a strong case for an advantageous settlement. The preliminary hearing for Daniel and Greg's case came 3 weeks later. I attended at the prosecutor's request, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching Daniel in his dark suit, the successful financial advisor costume now reading as costume rather than identity. The evidence presented was damning. Financial records showing years of manipulated accounts. Emails discussing how to placate increasingly suspicious clients. Documentation of transfers through shell companies connected to Weber. And finally, the cabin sale, presented as the desperate act that had ultimately exposed the entire operation. Seeing it all laid out chronologically made the pattern clear. What had begun as Daniel and Greg taking small shortcuts to inflate their performance had gradually evolved into full-scale fraud as they tried to cover previous deceptions. The cabin sale wasn't an anomaly but the logical conclusion of a path they'd started down years ago. When Daniel turned once during proceedings, scanning the courtroom until his eyes found mine, I neither looked away nor offered any supportive gesture. I simply met his gaze neutrally, a stranger observing another stranger's difficulties. After the hearing, Donovan approached with an update. Bennett's attorney has proposed a plea agreement. He'll plead guilty to reduced charges and provide complete testimony against Thompson and Weber's organization. What does that mean for his sentence? Still prison time, but significantly less. Probably 3 to 5 years rather than the potential 15+ he was facing. I nodded, processing the timeline. My husband would be incarcerated during what should have been our prime years together, building toward retirement, perhaps finally starting the family we'd repeatedly postponed for career advancements. And my cabin? That's part of why I wanted to speak with you. With Bennett's plea deal acknowledging the fraudulent sale, we have a clearer path to returning the property to you once the Weber investigation concludes. But we still need your formal testimony to complete the chain of evidence. I thought about it for only a moment. Schedule it whenever you need me. I want this finished. That evening, I finally answered the text from Daniel's mother. I'm not abandoning Daniel. He abandoned our marriage the moment he decided to commit fraud using my property. Please direct any future communication through my attorney. Then I filed for divorce, checking the box for irreconcilable differences when criminal betrayal of trust wasn't an available option. 6 months passed like a strange dream, time simultaneously dragging and rushing by. I found a small apartment in the Pearl District, its urban setting as different from my cabin as possible. The temporary leave from my brokerage became permanent when I decided to join a competing firm, one that valued my track record enough to weather the publicity storm. Daniel accepted the plea deal, receiving a 4-year sentence with possibility of parole after 30 months. His surrender date came and went with minimal contact between us, just sterile emails through attorneys finalizing divorce details. The marriage that had once been the bedrock of my identity ended with electronic signatures on digital documents, no face-to-face goodbye necessary or desired. The FBI eventually captured Weber in Vancouver, adding international flight to his list of charges. His arrest accelerated the resolution of the cabin situation. 9 months after discovering the fraudulent sale, I received the call I'd been waiting for. The property would be returned to my ownership following the completion of legal proceedings. The day I received the new deed, my name alone on the documentation, no husband to potentially betray my trust, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The cabin was mine again. Not exactly as before, it would always carry the shadow memory of betrayal, but still mine. Lauren flew out from Boston to accompany me on my first visit back. We drove the familiar winding roads in comfortable silence, both understanding the emotional significance of the journey. The cabin looked largely as I remembered, though Weber had made some changes to the landscaping and exterior paint. Inside, the FBI had removed all furnishings as part of their investigation, leaving empty rooms that echoed with our footsteps. It's like a blank canvas now, Lauren observed, watching me run my hand along the kitchen counter where Weber had once shown me the fraudulent deed. That's appropriate, I think. We spent that weekend cleaning, measuring, and planning a complete renovation. The cabin needed to become mine again in every sense, not the property that Daniel sold, not the asset that Weber purchased with dirty money, but a new creation reflecting who I had become through adversity. What about furniture? Lauren asked as we sat on the bare floor eating takeout by camping lantern. Are you going to try to get your original pieces back from the FBI? I shook my head. New start means new everything. Besides, I'm not the same person who chose those things. That was the truth at the heart of my recovery. The Rachel who had purchased this cabin, the Rachel who had married Daniel, had been different. More trusting, certainly. Perhaps more naive. But also more constrained by expectations about what a successful marriage and life should look like. The new Rachel, post-betrayal, post-divorce, post-illusion, made different choices. I started a support group for partners of white-collar criminals, discovering a surprisingly large community of people whose lives had been upended by financial crimes they hadn't committed but nonetheless suffered from. Through those connections, I began using my real estate expertise in unexpected ways. I offered free consultations to those who needed to sell homes quickly due to asset freezes or legal fees. I helped navigate the complexities of property sales involved in criminal proceedings. I became the realtor who understood that sometimes property transactions were traumatic rather than celebratory. My broker at the new firm, initially skeptical about this unusual specialization, became supportive when she saw how it translated into a loyal client base and positive press. The scandal connection transformed from liability to unique qualification. The renovation of the cabin became a metaphor for my reconstruction of self. I preserved the bones. The aspects of my identity that remained solid through crisis, while completely reimagining the interior landscape. The new design included a second bedroom that could serve as accommodation for women in my support group who needed temporary retreat space during their own legal ordeals. My parents visited that spring, helping plant a new garden along the porch, symbolic new growth to replace what had been lost. My father, whose quiet disappointment in Daniel had always been evident even before the betrayal, seemed to approve of the stronger, more independent daughter who had emerged from the crucible of the past year. "You know what impresses me most," he said as we transplanted wildflowers one afternoon. "You never once played the victim. You acknowledged the injustice without letting it define you." The observation struck me as profoundly true. I had been victimized, certainly. But I had refused the identity of victim, instead claiming agency in how I responded to circumstances beyond my control. One evening, sitting on my newly rebuilt porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in colors no betrayal could dim, I received an unexpected email. Daniel, writing from prison, had sent a message through his attorney. "I know words are meaningless after what I did, but I need to say them anyway. I'm sorry for betraying you and everything we built together. The counseling here has helped me understand the gradual compromises that led me to become someone capable of hurting the person I loved most. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I recognize the full extent of the pain I caused." I sat with the message for a long time, watching darkness settle over the valley below. There was a time when such an apology would have meant everything. Now, it was simply information, an acknowledgement that changed nothing about our past or separate futures, but perhaps offered the smallest closure. I didn't respond that night, or the next day. Eventually, weeks later, I sent a brief reply. "I accept your apology. I hope you find peace with your choices. I have found mine." The divorce finalized just before the one-year anniversary of discovering Weber in my cabin. The timing seemed appropriate, a full cycle completed, seasons changed, lessons integrated. When friends asked if I was dating again, I laughed and gestured at my packed schedule. The truth was more complex. I wasn't avoiding relationships, but I had developed a profound appreciation for my own company. After rebuilding myself from betrayal, I was in no rush to merge identities with someone new. "I'm enjoying getting to know myself again," I explained to Natalie over dinner, celebrating the cabin's official return to my name. The uncompromised version. She raised her glass. To reclamation, of property and self. It was the perfect toast for the journey I'd traveled. From the shock of discovering Weber in my cabin to the FBI interruption at dinner, through legal battles and divorce proceedings, I had reclaimed not just my property but my autonomy. The sanctuary I had originally purchased as a retreat from the world had become the catalyst for my most profound growth. The cabin still stood on the mountainside, its windows reflecting sunsets just as before. but now it represented something different, not an escape from life, but evidence of my resilience within it. Not a hiding place, but a vantage point from which to view how far I'd come. If you're watching this and facing your own betrayal, whether in marriage, friendship, or business, know that the path through pain isn't around it but through it. The hardest moments can become the foundation for your strongest self. I'd love to hear your stories of resilience in the comments below. And if this journey resonated with you, please subscribe and share with someone who might need to hear that betrayal isn't the end of their story. Just an unexpected chapter in a life they're still writing. Thank you for listening, and remember, what others take from you, they can never keep if you refuse to surrender your power to define what happens next.